Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung. Glossary. Amplification. Elaboration and clarification of a dream image by means of direct association, QV, and of parallels from the human science. Symbology, mythology, mysticism, folklore, history of religion, ethnology, etc. Anima and animus. Personification of the feminine nature of a man's unconscious and the masculine nature of a woman's. This psychological bisexuality is a reflection of the biological fact that it is the larger number of male or female genes which is the decisive factor in the determination of sex. The smaller number of contrasexual genes seems to produce a corresponding contrasexual character which usually remains unconscious. Anima and animus manifest themselves most typically in personified forms as figures in dreams and fantasies, dream girl or dream lover, and is the irrationalities of a man's feeling and a woman's thinking. As regulators of behavior, they are two of the most influential archetypes, QV. C.G. Jung, quote, "Every man carries within him the eternal image of woman, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a distinctive feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious, an hereditary factor of primordial origin, engraved in the living organic system of the man, or an imprint or archetype, QV, of all ancestral experiences of the female, a deposit, as it were, of all the impressions ever made by woman. Since this image is unconscious, it is always unconsciously projected upon the person of the beloved, and is one of the chief reasons for passionate attraction or aversion." Unquote, The Development of Personality, CW 17, page 198. Quote, "In its primary unconscious form, the animus is a compound of spontaneous, unpremeditated opinions which exercise a powerful influence on a woman's emotional life, while the anima is similarly compounded of feelings which thereafter influence or distort the man's understanding. Quote, she has turned his head, unquote. Consequently, the animus likes to project itself upon intellectuals and all kinds of heroes, including tenors, actors, sporting celebrities, etc. The anima has a predilection for everything that is unconscious, dark, equivocal, and related in women, and so also for her vanity, frigidity, helplessness, and so forth. The Practice of Psychotherapy, CW 16, paragraph 521. Quote, "No man can converse with an animus for 5 minutes without becoming the victim of his own anima. Anyone who still had enough sense of humor to listen objectively to the ensuing dialogue would be staggered by the vast number of commonplaces, misapplied truisms, cliches from newspapers and novels, shop-soiled platitudes of every description interspersed with vulgar abuse and brain-splitting lack of logic. It is a dialogue which, irrespective of its participants, is repeated millions and millions of times in all languages of the world and always remains essentially the same." IN CW 9.2, page 715. Quote, "The natural function of the animus, as well as the anima, is to remain in their place between the individual consciousness and the collective unconsciousness, QV, exactly as the persona, QV, is a sort of stratum between the ego consciousness and the objects of the external world. The animus and the anima should function as a bridge, or as a door leading to the images of the collective unconscious, as the persona should be a sort of bridge into the world." Unpublished. Some seminary notes, Visions 1, page 116. Archetype, C.G. Jung, quote, "The concept of the archetype is derived from the repeated observation that, for instance, the myths and fairy tales of world literature contain definite motifs which crop up everywhere. We meet these same motifs in the fantasies, dreams, deliria, and delusions of individuals living today. These typical images and associations are what I call archetypal ideas. The more vivid they are, the more they will be colored by particularly strong feeling tones. They impress, influence, and fascinate us. They have their origin in the archetype, which in itself is an irrepresentable, unconscious pre-existent form that seems to be part of the inherited structure of the psyche and can therefore manifest itself spontaneously anywhere, at any time. Because of its instinctive nature, the archetype underlies the feeling-toned complexities, QV, and share their autonomy. Citation and translation, CW 10, PAR 847. Quote, again and again I encounter the mistaken notion that an archetype is determined in regard to its content. In other words, that it is a kind of unconscious idea, if such an expression be admissible. It is necessary to point out once more that archetypes are not determined as regard their content, but only as regard their forms, and then only to a very limited degree. A primordial image, QV, is determined as its content only when it has become conscious and is therefore filled out with the material of conscious experience. Its form, however, quote, might perhaps be compared to the axial system of a crystal, which, as it were, performs the crystalline structure in the mother liquid, although it has no material existence of its own. The first appears according to the specific way in which the ions and molecules aggregate. The archetype in itself is empty and purely formal, nothing but a factualis preformandi, a possibility of representation which is given a priori. The representations themselves are not inherited, only the forms, and in that respect they correspond in every way to the instincts, which are also determined in form only. The existence of the instincts can no more be proved than the existence of the archetypes, as long as they do not manifest themselves concretely. The archetypes in collective unconscious, CW 9I, pages 79F. Quote, it seems to me probable that the real nature of the archetype is not capable of being made conscious, that it is transcendent, on which account I call it psychoid, QV. The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, Carl Jung, or CW 8, page 213. Association. The linking of ideas, perceptions, etc., according to similarity, coexistence, opposition, and causal dependence. Free association in Freudian dream interpretation. Spontaneous ideas occurring to the dreamer, which need not necessarily refer to the dream situation. Directed or controlled association in Jungian dream interpretation. Spontaneous ideas which proceed from a given dream situation and constantly relate to it. Association test. Methods for discovering complexities, QV, by measuring the reaction time and the interpretation, the answers to given stimulus words. Complex indicators, prolonged reaction time, faults, or the idiosyncratic quality of the answer when the stimulus words touch on complexes which the subject wishes to hide or of which she is not conscious. Complex, C.G. Jung, quote, complexes are psychic fragments which have split off owing to traumatic influences or certain incompatible tendencies. As the association experiments prove, complexes interfere with the intention of the will and disturb the conscious performance. They produce disturbances of memory and blockages in the flow of association, QV. They appear and disappear according to their own laws. They can temporarily obsess consciousness or influence speech and action in an unconscious way. In a word, complexes behave like independent beings, a fact especially evident in abnormal states of mind. In the voices heard by the insane, they even take on personal ego character, like that of the spirits, who manifest themselves through automatic writing and similar techniques. From the Structure and Dynamics of Psyche, CW 8, page 121. Consciousness, C.G. Jung. When one reflects what consciousness really is, one is profoundly impressed by the extreme wonder of the fact that an event which takes place outside in the cosmos simultaneously produces an external image, that it takes place, so to speak, inside as well, which is to say, becomes conscious. Basel Seminar, privately printed, 134, page 1. Quote, "For indeed our consciousness does not create itself. It wells up from unknown depths. In childhood it awakens gradually, and in all through life it wakes each morning out of the depths of sleep, from an unconscious condition. It is like a child that is born daily out of the primordial womb of the unconscious." Psychology and Religion, West and East, CW 11, pages 569F. Dream, C.G. Jung. Quote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the psyche, opening into the cosmic night, which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness may extend. All consciousness separates, but in dreams we put on the likeness of the more universal, truer, more eternal person dwelling in the darkness of the primordial night. When one is still the whole, and the whole is in one, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood." Well, not there. It says, "There one is still the whole, and the whole is in one, indistinguishable from nature and bare of all egohood. Out of these all uniting depths arise the dream, be it never so childish, grotesque, and immoral." Translation Civilization and Translation, CW 10 parts, 304F. Extraversion, attitude type characterized by concentration of interest on the external object. See introversion. God image, a term derived from the Church Fathers, according to whom the imago Dei is imprinted on the human soul. When such an image is spontaneously produced in dreams, fantasies, visions, etc., it is, from the psychological point of view, a symbol of the self, QV, of psychic wholeness. C.G. Jung, quote, "It is only through the psyche that we can establish that God acts upon us, and we are unable to distinguish whether these actions emanate from God or from the unconscious. We cannot tell whether God and the unconscious are two different entities. Both are borderline concepts for transcendental contents. But empirically it can be established with a sufficient degree of probability that there is in the unconscious an archetype of wholeness, which manifests itself spontaneously in dreams, etc., and a tendency, independent of the conscious will, to relate other archetypes to this center. Consequently, it does not seem improbable that the archetype produces a symbolism which has always characterized and expressed the deity. The God image does not coincide with the unconscious as such, but with a special content of it, namely the archetype of the self. It is this archetype from which we can no longer distinguish the God image empirically." Psychology and Religion, West and East, CW 11, pages 168F. Quote, "One can then explain the God image, quote, as a reflection of the self, or conversely, explain the self as an imago Dei in people." Unquote. Page 190. Okay. Hierogasmos, sacred or spiritual marriage, union of archetypal figures in the rebirth mysteries of antiquity and also in alchemy. Typical examples are the representation of Christ and the Church as bridegroom and bride, sponsus and sponsor, and the alchemical conjunction of sun and moon. Individuation, C.G. Jung, quote, "I use the term individuation to denote the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, that is, a separate indivisible unity or whole," unquote. The Archetypes in the Collective Unconscious, CW 9I, page 275. Quote, "Individuation means becoming a single homogeneous being, and, insofar as individuality embraces our innermost, last, and incomparable uniqueness, it also implies becoming one's own self. We could therefore translate the individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. from two essays on analytical psychology, CW 7, paragraphs 266. Quote, but again and again, I note that the individuation process is confused with the coming of the ego into consciousness, and that the ego is in consequence identified with the self, which naturally produces a hopeless conceptual muddle. Individuation is then nothing but ego-centered and autoeroticism. But the self comprises infinitely little self as more than a mere ego. It is as much oneself as all other selves as the ego. Individuation does not shut out one from the world, but gathers the world to oneself. Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, CW 8, pages 2 to 6. Inflation. Expansion of the personality beyond its proper limits by identification with the persona or with the archetype, or in pathological cases with a historical or religious figure. It produces an exaggerated sense of one's self-importance and is usually compensated by feelings of inferiority. Introversion. Attitude type characterized by orientation in life through subjective psychic contents. See extroversion. Mana. A Melanesian word for extraordinarily effective power emanating from a human being, object, action, or event, or from supernatural beings and spirits. Also health, prestige, and power to work magic and to heal, a primitive concept of psychic energy. Mandala, Sanskrit, magic circle, in Jung, symbol of the center, the goal, or the self, as psychic totality, self-representation of a psychic process of centering, production of a new center of personality. This symbolically represented by the circle, the square, or the quaternity, by symmetrical arrangements of the number of 4 and its multiples. In Lamsian and Tantric Yoga, the mandala is an instrument of contemplation, yantra, seat and birthplace of the gods. Disturbed mandala, any form that deviates from the circle, square, or equal-armed cross, or whose basic number is not 4 or its multiples. CGN. Quote, mandala means a circle, more especially a magic circle, and this form of symbol is not only to be found all through the East, but also among us. Mandalas are amply represented in the Middle Ages. The specifically Christian ones come from the earlier Middle Ages. Most of them show Christ in the center, with the 4 evangelists, or their symbols, as the cardinal points. This conception must be a very ancient one, because Horus was represented with his 4 sons in the same way by the Egyptians. For the most part, the mandala form in all of its is that of a flower, a cross, or a wheel, with a distinct tendency towards 4 as the basis of the structure. Commentary to The Secret of the Golden Flower, CW 13, paragraph 31, MOD. Quote, mandalas usually appear in situations of psychic confusion and perplexity. The archetype therefore constellated represents a pattern of order which, like the psychological viewfinder, marked with a cross or a circle divided into 4, is superimposed on the psychic chaos, so that each content falls into place, and the weltering confusion is held together by the protective circle. At the same time, there are yantras, instruments whose help the order is brought into being. Instruments whose help the order is brought into being. Citation, Civilization and Translation, CW 10, paragraph 803. Numinosum, Rudolf Otto's term, in his idea of the holy, for the inexpressible, mysterious, terrifying, directly experienced, and pertaining only to the divinity. Persona, originally the mask worn by an actor. C.G. Jung. The persona is the individual's system of adaptation to, or the manner one assumes in dealing with the world. Every calling and profession, for example, has its own characteristic persona. Only the danger is that people, become identical with their personas, the professor with his textbook, the tenor with her voice. One could say, with a little exaggeration, that the persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others thinks one is. The archetypes and the collective unconscious. CW 9I, pages 122F. Primordial image, Jacob Burckhardt, term originally used by Jung for archetype. Psychoid, soul-like or quasi-psychic, C.G. Jung. Quote, the collective unconscious represents a psyche that cannot be directly perceived or represented, in contrast to the perceptible psychic phenomenon, and on account of its irrepresentable nature. I have called it psychoid. Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, CW 8, pages 436. Quartinity, C.G. Jung. Quote, the quartinity is an archetype of almost universal occurrence. It forms the logical basis for any whole judgment. If one wishes to pass such a judgment, it must have this fourfold aspect. For instance, if you want to describe the horizon as a whole, you name the 4 quarters of heaven. There are always 4 elements, 4 prime qualities, 4 colors, 4 castes, 4 ways of spiritual development, etc. So too there are 4 aspects of psychological orientation. In order to orient themselves, we must have a function which ascertains that something is there, sensation. A second function which establishes what it is, thinking. A third function which states whether it suits us or not, whether we wish to accept it or not, feeling. And a fourth function which indicates where it came from and where it is going, intuition. When this has been done, there is nothing more to say. The ideal of completeness is a circle or sphere, but its natural minimal division is a quartinity. Psychology and Religion, West and East, CW 11, page 167. A quaternity or quaternion often has a 3+1 structure, in that one of the terms composing it occupies an exceptional position or has a nature unlike that of the others. For instance, 3 of the symbols of the evangelists are animals, and that of the 4th of St. Luke is an angel. This is the 4th, which, added to the other 3, makes them 1, symbolizing totality. In analytical psychology, often the inferior function, i.e. the function which is not at the conscious disposal of the subject, represents the 4th, and its integration into consciousness is one of the major tasks of the process of individuation. Self, the central archetype, the archetype of order, the totality of the personality, symbolized by circle, square, or quartinity, child, mandala, etc. C.G. Jung. Quote, the self is a quality that is supraordinate to the conscious ego. It embraces not only the conscious but also the unconscious psyche, and is therefore, so to speak, a personality which we also are. There is little hope of our ever being able to reach even approximate consciousness of the self, since however much we may make conscious, there will always exist an indeterminable amount of unconscious material which belongs to the totality of the self. 2 essays on analytical psychology, CW 7, paragraph 247. Quote, the self is not only the center, but also the whole circumference, which embraces both conscious and unconscious. It is the center of this totality, just as the ego is the center of consciousness. Psychology and Alchemy, CW 12, paragraph 44. Quote, the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of the fateful combination we call individuality. 2 essays on analytical psychology, CW 7, paragraph 404. Shadow, the inferior part of the personality, sum of all personal and collective psychic elements which, because of their incompatibility with the chaos conscious attitude are denied expression in life and therefore coalesce into the relatively autonomous splinter personality, which contrary tendencies in the unconscious. The shadow behaves compensatorily to consciousness, hence its effects can be positive as well as negative. In dreams, the shadow figure is always the same sex as the dreamer. C.G. Jung, quote, "The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about oneself, and yet is always thrusting itself upon one directly or indirectly. For instance, inferior traits of character and other incompatible tendencies. The archetype and the collective unconscious." CW 9I, paragraph 284F. The shadow is that hidden, repressed, for the most part inferior and guilt-laden personality whose ultimate ramifications reach back into the realm of our animal ancestors and so comprise the whole historical aspect of the unconscious. If it has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil, it can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious person, that is, one's shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, creative impulses, etc. Ion, CW 92, page 266. Soul, C.G. Jung. If the human soul is anything, it must be unimaginable complexity and diversity, so that it cannot possibly be approached through a mere psychology of instinct. I can only gaze with wonder and awe at the depths and heights of our psychic nature. Its non-spatial universe conceals an untold abundance of images, which has accumulated over millions of years of living development and become fixed in the organism. My consciousness is like an eye that penetrates to the most distant spaces, and yet it is the psychic non-ego that fills them with non-spatial images. And these images are not pale shadows, but tremendously powerful psychic factors. Besides this picture, I would like to place the specter of the starry heavens at night, for only the equivalent of the universe within is the universe without, and just as I reach the world through the medium of the body, so I reach the world through the medium of the psyche. Freud and Psychoanalysis, CW 4, pages 331F. Quote, "It would be blasphemy to assert that God can manifest himself everywhere save only in the human soul. Indeed, the very intimacy of this relationship between God and the soul automatically precludes any devaluation of the latter. I would be going perhaps too far to speak of an affinity, but at all events the soul must contain in itself the faculty in relation to God, i.e. correspondence, otherwise a connection should never come about. This correspondence is, in psychological terms, the archetype of the God image." Psychology and Alchemy, CW 12, paragraphs 11. Synchronicity. A term coined by Jung to designate the meaningful coincidence or equivalence of a psychic or a physical state or event which has no causal relationship to one another. Such synchronistic phenomena occur, for instance, when an inwardly perceived event, dream, vision, premonition, etc., is seen to have a correspondence to an external reality. The inner image of premonition has come true of similar or identical thoughts, dreams, etc., occurring at the same time in different places. Neither the one nor the other coincidence can be explained by causality, but seems to be connected primarily with activated archetypal processes in the unconscious. C.G. Jung, quote, "My preconception with the psychology of unconscious processes long ago compelled me to look about for another principle of explanation, because the causality principle seems to me, inadequate to explain certain remarkable phenomena of the psychology of the unconscious. Thus I found that there are psychic parallelisms which cannot be related to each other causally, but which must be connected through another principle, namely the contingency of events. This connection of events seemed to me essentially given by the fact that their relative similarity, hence the term synchronistic, that their relative simulanity, since the name synchronistic. It seems, indeed, as through time, far from being an abstraction, in a concrete continuum which contains qualities or basic conditions that manifest themselves simultaneously in different places through parallelisms that cannot be explained causally, as for example in cases of the simultaneous occurrence of identical thoughts, of identical thought symbols or psychic states. Richard Wellham, In Memoriam, CW 15, paragraph 81 mod. Quote, I choose this term because the simultaneous occurrences of two meaningfully but not causally connected events seemed to me an essential criterion. I am therefore using the general concept of synchronicity in the special sense of a coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events which have the same or similar meaning, in contrast to synchronicism, which simply means the simultaneous occurrence of two events. The Structure and Dynamics of Psyche, CW 8, paragraph 441. Quote, synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the discontinuities of physics. Start over. Synchronicity is no more baffling or mysterious than the discontinuity of physics. It is only the ingrained belief in the sovereign power of causality that creates intellectual difficulties and makes it appear unthinkable that causeless events exist or could ever occur. Meaningful coincidences are thinkable as pure chance, but the more they multiply and the greater and more exact the correspondence is, the more their probability sinks and their unthinkability increases, until they can no longer be regarded as pure chance, but for lack of causal explanation, have to be thought of as meaningful arrangements. Their inexplicability is not due to the fact that the cause is unknown, but to the fact that a cause may not even that a cause is not even thinkable in intellectual terms. Ibid, pages 518f. Unconscious, the unconscious. Quote, theoretically, no limit can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Theoretically, no limits can be set to the field of consciousness, since it is capable of indefinite extension. Empirically, however, it always finds its limits when it comes up against the unknown. This consists of everything we do not know, which, therefore, is not related to the ego as a center of the field of consciousness. The unknown falls into two groups of objects, those which are outside and can be experienced by the senses, and those which are inside and are experienced immediately. The first group comprises the unknown in the outer world, the second the unknown in the inner world. We call this latter territory the unconscious. IN, CW 9, 2, paragraph 3, or page 3. Quote, everything of which I know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking, everything of which I was once conscious, but have now forgotten, everything perceived by my senses, but not noted by my conscious mind, everything which, involuntarily and without paying attention to it, I feel, think, remember, want, and do, all the future things that are taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness, all this is the content of the unconscious. The Structure and Dynamics of the Psyche, CW 8, paragraph 1, page 185. Quote, besides these, we must include all more or less intentional representations of painful thoughts and feelings. I call the sum of all these contents the personal unconscious. But over and above that, we also find in the unconscious qualities that there are not individually acquired but are inherited, e.g. instincts as impulses to carry out actions from necessity, without conscious motivation. In this deeper stratum, we also find the archetypes. The instincts and archetypes together form the collective unconscious, I call it collective because, unlike the personal unconscious, it is not made up of individual and more or less unique contexts, but of those which are universal and of regular occurrence. Ibid, pages 133f. The first group comprises, quote, the first group comprises contents which are integral components of the individual personality and therefore could just as well be conscious. The second group forms, as it were, the omnipresent, unchanging, and everywhere identical quality or substrate of the psyche per se. IN CW 9I, page 7. Quote, the deeper layers of the psyche lose their individual uniqueness as they retreat further and further into darkness. Lower down, that is to say, they approach the autonomous function systems, they become increasingly collective until they are universalized and extinguished in the body's materiality, i.e., in chemical substance. The body's carbon is simply carbon, hence at the bottom the psyche is simply world. The archetypes in collective unconscious, CW 9I, page 173. So the book ends with a list of his collected works, which I'll read just because it'll be interesting to me. I think maybe you to look at the titles as sort of a long poem, and they are listed, I think, in order of date. Collected works of C.G. Jung. The publication of the first complete collected edition in English of the works of C.G. Jung has been undertaken by Routledge and Kegan Paul Limited in England and by Bollingen Foundation in the United States. Sir Herbert Reed, Dr. Michael Fordham, Dr. Gerhard Adler, and William McGuire composed the editorial committee. The translation is R.F.C. Hall. Since 1967, Princeton University Press has been the American publisher. In the following list, the dates of the original publication are given in the parenthesis of original composition in brackets. Multiple dates indicate revisions. Dagger denotes volumes and presentation. I'm not going to give the dates, I'm just going to read the titles. So I'm going to do the parts though. Part 1, Psychic Studies, on the psychological and pathology of so-called occult phenomena, on historical misreadings, cryptotomnesia, on manic mood disorder, the case of hysterical stupor in a prisoner in detention, on simulated insanity, a medical opinion on a case of simulated insanity, a third and final opinion on two contradictory psychic diagnoses, on the psychological diagnosis of facts. 2. Experimental researchers, translated by Leopold Stein in collaboration with Diana Riviere. Studies in word association, the association of normal subjects, an analysis of the association of the epileptic, the reaction time ratio in the association experiment, experimental observations in the facility of memory, psychoanalysis in the association experiments, the psychological diagnosis of evidence, association dream and hysterical symptom, the psychopathological significance of the association experiment, disturbances in reproduction in the association experiment, the association method, the family constellation. Psychophysical researchers. On the psychophysical relation of the association experiment, psychophysical investigations and the galvanometer and the phonograph in normal and insane individuals. Further investigations on the galvanic phenomenon and the respiration in normal and insane individuals. Appendix: statistical details of enlistment, new aspects of criminal psychology, the psychological methods of investigation used in the psychiatric clinic at the University of Zurich, on the doctrine of complexities, on the psychological diagnosis of evidence. 3. The psychogenesis of mental disease. The psychology of dementia praecox, the content of a psychosis, on psychological understanding, a criticism of Bleuler's theory of schizophrenic negativism, on the importance of the unconscious in psychopathology, on the problem of psychogenesis in mental disease and the psyche, on the psychogenesis of schizophrenia, recent thoughts on schizophrenia. 4. Freud and psychoanalysis. Freud's theory of hysteria, a reply to Offenberg. The Freudian theory of hysteria, the analysis of dreams, a contribution to the psychology of rumor, on the significance of number dreams, Morton Price, Mechanisms and Interpretation of Dreams, a critical review, on the criticism of psychoanalysis, concerning psychoanalysis, the theory of psychoanalysis, general aspects of psychoanalysis and neurosis, some crucial points in psychoanalysis, the Jung-Loy correspondence, preface to collected papers on analytical psychoanalysis, the significance of the father and the destiny of the individual, introduction to Cranfield's The Secret Way of the Mind, Freud and Jung contrasts. 5. Symbols of transformation. Original German version, Wundlangen and Symbol der Libido equals Psychology of the Unconscious. Appendix, the Miller Fantasies. 6. Psychological Types, Appendix, 4 papers on psychological typology. 7. 2 essays on analytical psychology. On the psychology of the unconscious, the relation between the ego and the unconscious, appendices. New paths in psychology, the structure of the unconscious. 8. The structure and dynamics of the psyche. On psychic energy, the transcendent function. A review of the complex theory, the significance of constitution and the heredity of the psychology, psychological factors determining human behaviors, instinct and the unconscious, the structure of the psyche, on the nature of the psyche, general aspects of dream psychology, on the nature of dreams, the psychological foundations of belief in spirits, spirit and life, basic postulates in analytical psychology and Weltanschauung, the real and the surreal, the stages of life, the soul and death, synchronicity, and acausal connecting principle. Appendix on synchronicity. Part 1. The archetypes and the collective unconscious. Archetypes of the collective unconscious. The concept of the collective unconscious concerning the archetypes, with special references to the anima concept. Psychological aspects of the mother archetype concerning rebirth. The psychology of the child archetype. The psychological aspects of the core. The phenomenology of the spirit in fairy tales. On the psychology of the trickster figure, conscious, unconscious, and individuation, a study in the process of individuation, concerning mandala symbolism. Appendix, mandalas. Part 11, Ion, researchers into the phenomenology of the self. Part 10, civilization and translation. The role of the unconscious, mind and earth, archaic man, the spiritual problems of modern man, the love problem of the student, women in Europe, the meaning of psychology for modern man, the state of psychotherapy today, Wotan, after the catastrophe, the fight with the shadow, epilogue to essays on contemporary events, the undiscovered self, present and future, flying saucers, a modern myth, the psychological view of conscious, good and evil in analytical psychology, introduction to Wolff's studies in Jungian psychology, the Swiss line in the European spectrum, reviews of Kaiserling's American Set Free and La Révolution Mondiale, complications of American psychology, the dreamlike world of India, what India can teach us, appendix documents. 11. Psychology and religion, West and East. Western religion. Psychology and religion, Terry lectures. A psychological approach to the dogma of the Trinity. Transformation, Symbolism, and the Mass. Forward to White's God in the Unconscious and Orblowski's Lucifer and Prometheus. Brother Klaus, Psychotherapists or the Clergy, Psychoanalysts and the Cure of Souls. Answer to Job. Eastern Religion. Psychological commentaries on the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Yoga in the West. Forward to Suzuki's Introductions to Zen Buddhism. The Psychology of Eastern Meditation. Holy Men of India. Introduction to Zimmer's Dirweg zum Zilbast. Forward to I Ching. 12. Psychology and Alchemy. Introduction to the religious and psychological problems of alchemy. Individual dreams, symbolism in relation to alchemy. Religious ideals and alchemy. Epilogue. 13. Alchemical studies. Commentary on the secret of the garden flower. Visions of Zosimus. Paracelsus and the spiritual phenomenon. The spirit Mercurius. The philosophical tree. 14. Mysterium Conjunctionis. An inquiry into the separation and synthesis of psychic opposites in alchemy. 15. The Spirit in Man, Art, and Literature. Paracelsus and the Physician. Sigmund Freud in his historical setting, In Memory of Sigmund Freud. Richard Wilhelm in Memoriam. On the relation of analytical psychology to poetry. Psychology and Literature, Ulysses, a Monologue. Picasso. 16. The Practice of Psychotherapy. General problems of psychotherapy. Principles of practical psychotherapy. What is psychotherapy? Some aspects of modern psychotherapy. The aims of psychotherapy. Modern problems of modern psychotherapy. Psychotherapy and the psychotherapy of life. Medicine, psychotherapy today. Fundamental questions of psychotherapy. Specific problems of psychotherapy. The therapeutic value of abreaction. Practical use of dream analysis. Psychology and of the transference. Appendix, realities of practical psychotherapy. 17. Development of the personality. Psychic conflicts in the child. Introduction to Wicks, the Analysis der Kinderskill, Child Development and Education, Analytical Psychology and Education, 3 lectures, The Gifted Child, The Significance of the Unconscious in Individual Education, The Development of Personality, Marriage as a Psychological Relationship, Final Volumes, Posthumous and Other Miscellaneous Works, Biography of C.G. Jung's Writings, in General Index to the Collected Works. Related publications. C.G. Jung Letters, 1906 to 1950. Selected and edited by Gerhard Adler in collaboration with Nelia Jaffe. C.G. Jung Psychological Reflections, a new anthology of his writings. And then Analytical Psychology in Theory and Practice. And that's it. Thank you if you listened this long.